I'm here today with Marilyn McEntyre. Marilyn is the author of many highly regarded books, including the second edition of Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies, which was recently published by Erdman's. Marilyn's a writer and served as professor of literature and medical humanities at UC Berkeley and at New College, Berkeley. Marilyn is the author of 15 books, including a collection of poems called Occasions and a reflections titled When Poets Pray. She's won several outstanding teaching and writing awards, and her writing has appeared in The Christian Century, Weaving, Sojourners, Prism, Conversations, Christianity Today, Academic Medicine, and plenty of other quality venues. Marilyn's been a featured speaker at Writing for Your Life and the other events that we've been engaged in too, and it always is such a pleasure to have you here with us, Marilyn. So thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.
I really mean it when I say Marilyn is really highly regarded, kind of within our field. She's looked at as, one of the preeminent writers of quality. So I've always had a tremendous respect for her work. But we are here to talk about the new book. But before we get to that, I'd really love for you to kind of give us more background information, than what I was able to just briefly touch on.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a little hard to know which strand to pull on in my CV. Somebody looked at my resume one time and said, "So what exactly do you do?" Because I have had, of course, a long career in academia, but I left full-time undergraduate teaching in 2008, and since then have been teaching I've taught at 2 or 3 seminaries, and I've taught for 10 years part-time in the medical program at UCSF, UC Berkeley, the joint medical program, which was such a pleasure. So medical humanities has been an abiding interest of mine for many years. And more recently, a lot of work on approaches to writing that somehow find that middle ground between academic writing and personal writing. I'm really interested in helping writers foster a public voice that can invite people into what I think of as kind of intimate space and can bring together the language of spirituality and thought, intellectual engagement in a way that is credible to a wide audience. I think people who are publishing trade books are trying to find that middle ground too. But a lot of academics are a little tired of writing for other academics. And so how do we speak into the public now? And how do we speak into the public with vigorous, careful attention to our language and to the issues that are confronting all of us without being strident, but certainly finding a powerful voice? There are all kinds of interesting challenges there. So yeah, so increasingly when people say, "What do you do?" I think, well, I try to cultivate my own and others' writing lives around spirituality, health, language, and the stories that need to be told now.
Well, I think it's, really unfortunate. I mean, the kind of challenge you're describing is getting worse, quite frankly, in my mind, because of a couple of things. One is that our culture's reading level is probably decreasing as opposed to getting more sophisticated. And the second is a lot of the bigger publishing houses seem to care more about celebrity than they care about substance. And, that's really disappointing to me, because I care a lot more about substance and thought and, moving our culture forward. And, the kind of writing that you're talking about does that, but I don't think it gets the audience that it should. I don't think it gets the push that it should from the industry. So, I'm venting a little bit, but that's just some of the unfortunate aspects of the landscape that I see.
Well, it's interesting what you're bringing up, and you're more familiar with this than I am because you inhabit that world. But I do think that the language of marketing and the objectives of marketing, which are important and legitimate in getting the written word out to a wide public, also tend sometimes to undermine the relational dimension of writing and reading, which is, I think, pastoral. And if you really want to write from the heart and reach people um, in those mysterious ways, I really think that the Spirit works in our words and in our lives to uh, take things where they need to go. There's a flow that we can't control. But marketing comes in, and there's a certain pressure on writers to market their own work and therefore to write something that is marketable. And so I think in the same way that I've been very interested in the question of what it is to practice healthcare in a capitalist culture, or as I think of it, a late stage predatory capitalist culture, that affects higher education. It affects writing and dispersal of writing. All of those things I think are increasingly pressured by an economic model that is somewhat invasive.
Well, you'll get a kick out of another author friend of mine and I have been asked to give a talk at another conference, not one of mine, that's basically called The Spirituality of Marketing.
Yeah.
So
I want to hear that one.
yeah. Well, we're going to delve into this, tension even further. And, I think, I believe that there are ways to do marketing and there are ways to do marketing. And marketing doesn't necessarily have to be a dirty word, right? I mean, and if anything, if what I said a moment ago is true, that there's this, increasing pressure or a push for celebrity as opposed to substance. If that means that there are a few people who are actually writing with substance, then it gives you a little bit of a differential advantage because, I think there's still a lot of people who will pay attention to you and pay attention to that. And marketing that, so to speak, is useful and I think productive, even
Right.
if some in the publishing industry may not view it that way.
Right. Well, it is a very interesting question to which there isn't a definitive answer, but I do think sometimes that those of us who are introverts and who would just as soon write things, put them out there with a little prayer that they go to the right people and move on with our lives, that's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen. You're absolutely right. Independent
Right.
of anything else that we say. But, that's unfortunately the nature of the industry these days, right? Is that, rising above the noise, especially for newer authors, right? That don't have
Well,
the kind of track record and the following that, someone like you has.
yeah.
The key for them is, okay, how do I rise above the noise, right? So,
Right. The noise is a good word for it. Although I have to say that the upside is that in that universe of noise and all that's going on the internet, there are, especially this past year, so many things happening on Zoom, so many conversations and so many writers in connection who appear in connection with each other. And so I think some of that interface between celebrity and marketing and the writing itself can be generative in the way that it invites people into the immediacy of a conversation. So I'm grateful for that.
I totally agree. And part of my theory on that is that it's easier to build smaller niche communities than it ever has been.
Yeah.
Because of the decrease in emphasis or requirement around geography.
Right.
Right. So for whatever the area of interest is that we're talking about, you can collect people, right? Get people engaged from all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Not just, I'm going to be speaking, at this school today or, that venue tomorrow or what have you, right? So that is incredibly valuable, I think.
It is.
From
It is. And I think there are many people who are not that eager to go back to in-person teaching or workshops. But I think we're all going to end up with some hybrid, and that one of the very, very costly blessings that might come out of the pandemic is that we are able to find new ways to create, to foster community with each other.
Absolutely. I'm a big believer in that. And even when I'm able to start having in-person conferences again, which I will do, I will still also do online conferences just because of the kind of thing that we're talking about, the value of it. So So we'll see, but it is going to be a hybrid world, I think.
Yeah.
So let's get back to, your work and your writing. Before we get to, caring for words, you want to talk a little bit about some of the other books that you've written?
Yeah. Well, last year, Speaking Peace in a Climate of Conflict came out, and that was, in a sense, a sequel to Caring for Words, in that both of them addressed the general question of how do we be good stewards of language? How do we care for the gift of language? And the analogy I used throughout both was the care of the soil, care of the environment, because language is an environment, this discursive environment we inhabit can either be depleted, and depleted soil doesn't produce food, edible food. So it can either be depleted and some words can really become effectively useless, or it can be nourished and made alive again. One of my favorite books is the little book by William Bryant Logan called Dirt, The Ecstatic Life of the Soil. And he starts out by talking about the composition of the soil and that all of us are made of stardust and that the planet is. And so I think in the same way, there's a sense in which our lives are woven together by language. And the language environment we inhabit is vulnerable, especially now as I've said, in a kind of economic environment where language, along with everything else, becomes commodified. It becomes a product and not so much a process or a flow of energy among us as something that gets packaged and postered and billboarded and used as almost a design feature in many spaces online. And so the nuance of language tends to get subordinated to the noise, as you put it. So that's been my concern in those two books. And I think I wrote the first book, or at least the first version of Caring for Words in between 2005, 2009. So that's a while ago now. And even at that point, I was very concerned about the character of public discourse, the way in which partisanship had expropriated certain words for partisan purposes, and also the commercial appropriation of words and the ways in which in certain environments, words get used up because they're used over and over and over, and they become trivialized or they become triggers. And so how do we retrieve them is one governing question. And some of the strategies that I mentioned in the first book are just love words. First of all, pay attention to words and not just to ideas, but what's actually happening in a sentence. And what difference does it make which verb you choose? And don't tolerate lies was one of the chapters in the first book, which is to say that to the extent that we just shrug off lies that we recognize as lies in the political sphere, for instance, and don't challenge them, we're participating in them. And then practice poetry was another chapter, which is to say that poetry is really a life-giving kind of practice, not just producing a book of poems, but working with words in the ways that you have to if you engage with poetic language. And then there were other strategies in the Speaking Peace, like pay attention to your metaphors. Where do they come from and what do they imply? Or notice euphemisms and the consequences of euphemism. So I had a good time writing both of those. I also wrote a book last year that came out from Broadleaf called Dear Doctor, and it was about the clinical conversation between doctors and patients and how circumscribed that conversation has become for institutional reasons. But what might we do in order to nuance the ways we talk about health, which for many people includes their economic welfare and their spirituality and what they eat? It's surprising how often that doesn't get asked because medical schools often don't teach nutrition. That's its own conversation. So those are some of the things I've been working on. And I mentioned before we started the interview that I've just finished working on co-authoring a book with Shirley Showalter that will come out next year on grandparenting. Very different kind of book.
Well, you're skilled at writing anything that you want to write. I mean, I know that. So whatever the topic is, it'll come out really, really well.
Thank you.
But being a grandparent myself, I'm looking forward to that one.
Thanks.
So, it's just really the concept of communication tools is an interesting one for me, right? And communication tools exist at different levels, right? So you're talking specifically about words, right? But there's also the medium question. Is it words on text? Is it words that are on video like we're on right now? Is it words communicated, through the internet in some way or on TV or some other medium? And, they're all tools, right, for conveying ideas, and all can be used and misused at every level, right? So, the whole, idea that you're addressing about not misusing words, I, think that a similar degree of thought needs to go into not misusing other types of communications too.
Right. And I would go a step beyond they are tools for communicating to say that words are little packets of energy. When you speak a word into the world, something shifts. And the ancient Hebrews, as I understand this from a linguist, Barry Sanders, I'm very fond of, he said that they had this very high view of language, that that utterance, a spoken word comes out on the breath of life. You're putting something into the world. And the Hebrew word for word is the same as the word for thing, dabar. You've made a thing. And so I think of words as offerings and words as connective tissue among us, and words as a flow of energy that we put into the room, the environment. And that is to say, I think there's a utilitarian way to think about words, but words also do have a spiritual dimension that's fascinating to explore historically. We're not the first people to have thought that.
Well, even in the realm of spirituality, I consider that to be utilitarian too, right? There's practical aspects of that, just like there's practical aspects of anything else. So, but I love the flow of energy concept, and kind of an offering into the world. I love that. So, we've talked about how Caring for Words is just releasing, a second edition. What brought that about? How does it differ from the first edition?
It's not hugely different, but since it had been out there a while and some people are using it as a textbook, I just thought it needed to be updated. I wrote it, 2009 or the years immediately preceding. That was the year when it was the Bush administration. Some of the references have to do with the Iraq war that was going on. And so part of the point was to update some of the offhand references that I just tended to make throughout. Part of it was just to re-examine who am I speaking to? Who's the audience, and what are the concerns of people now? So a lot of it was just sentence tinkering. I didn't go through and completely overhaul chapters, but I think if people are familiar with the first book, they'll recognize some of the ways in the second one that I went through it sentence by sentence and just thought, who am I talking to now? What are we concerned about now? The polarization is that much worse. The particular words that have been expropriated or misused in public and become triggers or become really familiar reference points, like a phrase like "make America great again" has become very, very loaded to the point where the word great has some resonance around it that it might not have 10 years ago. So that's just one example.
I've personally avoided using that word because of exactly what you said
for
years now.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate, but
it's a good example, isn't it, of how words get to become the property of a group for a while. And the word evangelical, there are a number of Christian groups that I know who have struggled over their own historic ownership of the word evangelical and are distancing themselves from it because the word has come to mean something much more specific. So I tried to take on some of the more current issues around very particular words to look at how they're getting highly charged and how they become triggers in public conversation.
Interesting. Well, very good food for thought.
I hope so.
So I know you talked about your grandparent book coming out. Have you got any other projects that you can talk about, at least directionally?
Yeah, I have. Well, I did come out with a book of Lenten readings. They're not very deeply tied to Lent, except that during Holy Week, they are specific to that. But they're 40 readings that I loved doing. And, I've done several of that kind of book, word by word, with looking at a word each day for a week and doing a short reflection. And then I did a book of Advent readings. So this is similar. And I'm working on one for Broadleaf that will be readings for Advent, but I think that's 2022. So I love doing those. And part of doing the daily reflection kind of book is, my hope is that one of the messages readers will get is, go thou and do likewise. This is really a wonderful practice. This is a way of sitting with whatever emerges in your reading and reflection or Lectio Divina in the morning, and just writing about the phrase or the word that comes up, what it brings up. So it's really, I hope that these books will be just invitational. And then I do have a couple of other projects in the pipeline. I'm hoping to write a book, but this is pretty early on at the contract stage, on practicing trust in times of transition, which is the title of a workshop I've given in a number of places. But I think we are in times of very deep transition in terms of the forms of energy that we are using and trying to develop, and in terms of our understanding of nationalism and nationhood, and in terms of how the church understands itself and its role, and how we even describe to ourselves, amongst ourselves as people of faith, who we are. So I'm really, really interested in if we put that umbrella of transition over what's happening, how do we understand where we came from and what we're moving toward? And how do we relax into that and, practice trust? I keep thinking of the disciples in the boat. They were right to be concerned, so Jesus wakes up and says, effectively, what's your problem? And then calms the wind and the waves, but the wind and the waves were really there. So we're in the wind and the waves, I think.
Well, that sounds like a really interesting book. And, at some point I'd love to talk with you more about that. Personally, I view the whole concept of trust as incredibly important.
Yeah.
And when I give my own class, The Business of Being a Spiritual Writer, that's one of the things I really hone in on, about the fact that, whether you think of like business assets that you have, the trust that you have with people, the relationships that you have that are high trust relationships are by far the most important asset that any of us has, I think.
That's right. And I also think about the level of trust that you learn from coaches, for instance. I've used athletic analogies a lot, but just trust your body, bend your knees, relay. If you're surfing, relax into this huge wave that could, kill you. Or if you're playing tennis, just relax and let your arm fall back before you swing and you get more power. But all of that, trust your body, trust your instincts, trust what you already know, trust what's given in the moment, trust the movement of the spirit that brings us into that improvisatory moment of play when we're doing anything with open hearts and attentiveness. I think trust is just many dimensional, but the people who live most effectively, I think of as people who can step out on trust and say, okay, it'll come.
Very cool. Can't wait for that.
Me too.
Well, Marilyn, it's a pleasure as always to be able to have a conversation with you. I just love the work that you've done. I love the way that you think and express it. And, thank you so much for all the offerings you put into the world.
Well, thank you, Brian, for all that you do. It's just really such a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, it's my pleasure, Marilyn. Thanks so much.
Okay.